Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events this afternoon or evening, depending upon where in the world you are. We're really happy to have our good friend Val McDermid back with us to talk about her really terrific new book, first in a new series, 1979. And we sold out of our signed British copies, but we have plenty of good old unsigned American copies, and I'll be happy to put a link in the comments field for you. And if you have questions for Val or Barbara, you know, as they occur to you throughout the hour, just put them in the comments field, and I will emerge towards the end of the hour. I'll be happy to ask any of them. So, Barbara, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. This is so much fun. You know, Val, we had a whole nostalgia day on Sunday. It was our 32nd bookstore birthday.
That's
And
lovely.
it reminded me of all the good times you and I have had over, it must be at least 30 years. So I thought we might have fun reviewing a few of them. I'm going to start by reminding you, do you remember we were sitting out with, I think, a lot of alcohol in a garden?
Surely not.
Oh, surely not. A garden at your alma mater, St. Hilda's College, Oxford. And somewhere in there, you introduced me and the other people to the Chalet School books. I've never forgotten that. So for the benefit of those of you who don't know what we're talking about, tell us about the Chalet books, because it was just fascinating.
Well, I can still remember the look of sheer bewildered disbelief on the faces of the Americans in the room as we started talking about the Chalet School books. I devoured everything from the local library when I was a kid, but my absolute favourites were a series of novels called The Chalet School. And there are 50-odd novels, and they were written over a period of time from the early 1930s into the 1960s, and they were written by a woman called Eleanor M. Brent-Dyer. And they're set, as this title suggests, in a school, initially in the Austrian Tyrol. And then there was the unfortunate advent of the Second World War, which meant they had to leave for a while, and they went to the Channel Islands, and then they eventually came back to the Alps, to Switzerland. And the thing I loved about the Chalet School books was that they were written as a proper series. You know, you read so many kids' books like Nancy Drew or The Famous Five, and it seems to take place in the same sempiternal summer. Nobody ever gets older. Nobody grows up. And nobody ever learns either. Nobody ever says, we better not go into the dark, lonely cave, because remember the bad things that happened the last time we went in a dark, lonely cave. But the Chalet School was different. Time passed and people grew up. And things had consequences. So you break your leg in one book and 3 books later, you're still limping. And you, as I say, you watch these characters grow up into the world and become not just wives and mothers, but have proper careers as doctors, lawyers, lecturers at universities. And that was where I discovered that writers got paid money for writing books. There's one of the books, one of the characters grows up to become a writer of girls' school stories in a way that we'd now think of as being quite meta, but nobody thought that then. And one of the books, she gets a letter from her publisher, and in the letter is a check. And I just like, oh my God, you get paid for doing this. And I don't know how I'd thought the books arrived in the library before that point. You know, nice people wrote them for fun. But that was the point where I decided that was what I was going to be when I grew up. So the Chalet School transformed my life, and it's full of these extraordinary characters. I mean, there's one who she's got her hair cut like a boy, and she always strides around with her hands in her blazer pockets, and she's called Tom Gay. Hello, it's just couldn't make it up.
No, absolutely not. You can probably hear the thunder here crashing, which is such a rare event in Phoenix, but we'll go on. So as I said to Val, I met her first at Oxford and possibly in London, and then she kept moving north. So I can remember visiting her in Manchester, and on one memorable occasion, and I think, Val, it was some kind of a book festival in Manchester. And do you remember there was a terrible snowstorm and we were all snowed in at your house?
Right. Yeah. That's right, we were. And you were concerned that you'd never get out. You might be trapped there.
Well, I mean, everything shut down. It was the first time I realized that not only the motorways were closed because there wasn't any way to plow them and the airport was closed. That's no surprise. But you would think train service would be okay. But it turns out that the old train tracks contracted with the cold. And so the trains were all down too. So we had this wonderful kind of lost in time weekend at Val's. And I'm trying to remember, had I brought you an award or had you just won one? Because I remember we sort of set it up in your office. Was it the Dillis Award?
I don't think it was the Dillis. Was it when I got the the
Was
one
it the LA Times Award for Place of Execution?
I think it was what's my brain? I'm getting old. The one in Indiana, one at Ball State, Muncie, Indiana.
Oh, Magna Cum Murder.
Magna Cum Murder. Sorry, my brain's getting old. And they gave me this sort of piece of art, which was a sort of skull with a beating heart as a clock. And I still have the papier-mâché skull in my office in Edinburgh.
Yes, it was really an interesting award. And I remember since we, aside from food and drink and, wondering if we were ever going to leave Manchester, we looked at the award. Then I can remember at I think it was the 2011, I might have the year wrong, BoucherCon in Baltimore, Maryland, in which Rob and I were the Lifetime Achievement or whatever, the award you get for being old and surviving in crime fiction. And Val was introduced us. Rob and I were late because we hadn't paid attention and kind of stumbled up on stage. And that's when I remembered that Val before had made this terrific offer that in the event that either Rob or I fell over dead, she would take the survivor of either of us. And that was before she met Joe. And actually, before we adopted the brand new puppies. But I've always thought that was such a generous offer. And, we'll never know. But would you have done it?
If the circumstances had arisen. Yeah. Because either one of you comes with many bonus points.
Well, true friendship, right? It's kind of like figuring out what to do with your children or your dogs in the event that you go. But what happens to your spouse? And so it's great to know that Val is out there for backup. Hey,
well, you come with the books, and Rob comes with the deep fried turkey. No.
Yes, and he did actually make a turducken once, but unfortunately, you weren't here for that.
No.
So I first met Val. I think it was actually reading her wonderful Kate Brannigan series, a series of private eye novels set in Manchester, unsurprisingly. But she first burst into print with a series, and it ties into 1979, about a reporter called Lindsay Gordon. And I do have here my cherished copy. It's kind of hard to see it because of the reflection, but it's called Book for Murder. And it's the 5th Lindsay Gordon mystery. So Val, this is based in part upon your own experience as a young girl reporter, right? So
yeah, I used the facts of my life, if you like. I started off with Lindsay as a reporter because it was my apprenticeship. The first 3 Lindsay Gordon novels were my apprenticeship. I was trying to learn to become a crime writer, and I felt very uncertain about my plotting skills. I didn't think I was a very good plotter. And so I thought if I set the books in a world, in a milieu that I understood and that I knew about, then it would be a lot easier for me to concentrate on the plotting. And if I made the character have the kind of job that when I understood how journalism works, what's possible, what's not possible, how things get done. And I thought that meant I could concentrate much more on the nuts and bolts of how I was going to commit this murder and solve it. So that was really why I started there. And that book you've got there, Book for Murder, is a book that really shouldn't exist, because my initial plan was to write 3 Lindsay Gordon novels. And the main reason for that was that the book I really wanted to write was the 3rd one. And I couldn't figure out how to get there without writing the first 2. I think now I'd have a slightly more sophisticated narrative skills, and I'd be able to wrap it all up in one book. But 3 books, 3 different sets of royalties. What's not to like?
Absolutely nothing. One of the things I remember in talking to Val about the Lindsay Gordon books was that she pointed out that Lindsay went out on interviews and so forth wearing what the British call trainers, which we call gym or tennis shoes. And part of that was because it would be really hard to run away if you were wearing, high heels and so forth. So you were being realistic about Lindsay and, what she was facing up to. Did you ever actually go out anywhere in high heels to do any crime reporting? Or reporting in general?
Yeah, I mean, there were times when you knew what your job was for the day and you knew that you had to be smartly dressed for it, I did wear high heels when I went to interview Prince Charles at Windsor Castle.
Awesome. Well, that was that all before social media, so we don't have any actually great pictorial record?
I think there's a couple of pictures on my website.
I'll have to go look. I love it.
Photographs were taken.
I know. I mean, Patrick and I now refer to our phones as gold mines, because it's amazing how easy it is to record all these seminal events, but we didn't have that option then. So a next big milestone in Val's writing life was this book, right?
Yeah.
And I love your story of the inspiration that overtook you while driving on the motorway. I think this is the right book for that.
That was the Mermaid Singing.
Okay. Well, I have the Mermaid Singing too. Sorry, I pulled the wrong one. So tell us about the Mermaid Singing.
Well, the Mermaid Singing was intended as a standalone, really, and unlike most of my novels, it arrived fully formed, like Minerva springing from the head of Zeus. I was driving down the motorway, and literally, the story just popped into my head. The shape of the story, the characters, the nature of their job, the setting. How it was going to be resolved, who the victims were. I just knew it all at once. And that's never happened to me before or since. With me, books take quite a long time from that initial idea to working out how to tell the story, who these people are, whose story is it. And usually, like so often you start at the end in a way, you start with the murder and you work backwards from the murder. But with the Mermaid Singing, everything was there, right there. And I actually had to pull over to the side of the road to make a note, because I thought, if I don't write this down, I might have lost it by the time I get home. And I was praying that I wouldn't get stopped by a traffic cop and have to claim that this was a narrative emergency.
A narrative emergency. I love that. And of course, you were waiting. This was before you could actually text or take notes while driving, right?
No. This was a old-fashioned reporter's notebook and a pen. So yeah, that was how that book appeared to me. And as I say, I'd intended that to be a standalone. But as I worked my way through the book, and I came towards the end, I realized that Tony Hill and Carol Jordan were really interesting characters, both in terms of their personalities and in terms of the jobs that they did. And I thought that there would be maybe some more stories for them to tell. And that led me, the next one was The Wire and the Blood, which of course was the title of the television adaptation of the books that ran for 6 very successful series, and a special which we filmed in Texas, bizarrely.
I know. Well, television is an art form all of its own, but certainly it was an exciting series. And you, in fact, have written to date 11 of the Tony Hill and Carol Jordan novels. You've also written a series about Karen Peary, which are, 2, 4, 6. Wasn't that the last book that we talked about? Was the most recent?
Yes,
Karen
Still
Peary?
Life.
Which
Still
I
Life.
absolutely loved. It was a book that involves Scottish policing, British policing, Irish policing. It was kind of a tour, if you will, around various policing departments. And I thought it was fabulous. So now you've started yet a new series, which we'll talk about in a second, about Allie Burns. But I did want to mention one more milestone novel in your career, which is called A Place of Execution, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Was nominated for all kinds of awards, won more, became a movie, which I have seen on TV, and was a huge international bestseller. And this was a standalone, isn't it, Val?
It is a standalone, yeah. People have often said, would you not like to write another novel with George Bennett at the heart of it? But I don't see how you can roll back from this is George Bennett's most important case to this is George Bennett's second most important case. because of the nature of the book. We see George at the time of the case, but we also see him many years later. So there's nowhere you could place a second book with him at the heart of it, I don't think.
No, I think I remember reading it thinking that the story was complete in itself. And, I think it must be, for a person who's written a lot of series, I think it must be wonderful to write one book in which everybody's in jeopardy. You don't have to really think about, continuing them or their lives afterwards. You leave them. It's kind of like, in Rebecca, when the house burns down and the whole thing and the De Winters go, that's it. Or Gone with the Wind, Scarlett goes back to Tara and that's it.
I think so. And I think it's something that in these days of particularly of in the intensive technical investigation of crime, it's very difficult to have protagonists who are not in some way professional investigators. I think if you want to write novels now that have what you might call an amateur sleuth, it's very hard to get away with doing more than one of those because it's just not credible anymore.
I think that's a very good point. And actually, now we're going to segue into 1979 because you have cleverly gone back in time to write about a new reporter called Allie Burns. And I'm assuming since she works for a Glasgow newspaper called The Clarion, and she's kind of a new female reporter in a pretty much male-dominated environment. Is there some autobiographical element in this book?
Well, what I would say, Barbara, is that the anecdotage is mine. But if I was writing my 1979, it would be a very different book, as 1979 was kind of the heyday of me being young, free and single. So
Okay.
there's a lot that isn't that would have to be in this book if it was my story. It's very much Allie's story, and she's very much not me. But the nuts and bolts of how the newsroom operates, how journalism operated in tabloids in Glasgow at that period is very much as it was. Again, I've drawn on what I know. And the great thing about journalists, particularly journalists at that period, was you kind of got a ringside seat at all the big events. It wasn't like now where everybody's a citizen journalist and everybody has a camera phone. Back then, there was definitely a case of privileged access for journalists and photographers. And so you got the inside track on what was going on. And that, I think, enables you to tell stories that are not necessarily accessible to another kind of investigator.
Right. Well, I mean, today when it's all about clicks, I mean, if you've been reading about controversies over Facebook and so forth, and I thought the woman who came forward this weekend on, I think it was 60 Minutes to talk about her concerns of Facebook, one of them is that she said, that people return if their emotional state is heightened and they keep going back. And it seems to me that so much of the media today is really looking for clicks, is looking for shock value and clicks much more than it is actual reporting or being responsible.
And this book I'm planning this as the first of 5 novels set at 10-year intervals, which will take us up to 2019. And one of the many things that I will be looking at, giving a sideways look to in the course of that, is how the media has changed and how our consumption of media has changed over those 41 years. And Allie, of course, is at the heart of that. It's fascinating. I think it's been a time of greatly accelerated change the last 40 years. And there's so many different aspects that will feed into this book, these books. Technology, politics, science, forensics, food we eat, the music we listen to, the way we consume media. So much has changed. And I think it's going to be quite interesting to have a kind of ringside seat on the sort of milestones of that. And it's also, I have to be honest here, it's a cop-out in a way. It's a way to avoid writing a memoir, which again is partly because a lot of people would have to die before I could write an honest memoir that would keep me out of the libel courts. But also, I'll be absolutely honest, I don't really want to spend a year, 2 years staring into my own navel. I'm not that interesting to me. So I'd rather tell other people's stories. I'd rather make stuff up than have to go delving back into my past. But the idea of this sequence of novels allows me to use things I've experienced over those years and use them as fuel for fiction.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I talked to a Swedish author yesterday called Alex Schulman in the middle of the Facebook down. So we haven't yet posted it, but he wrote four autobiographical novels, one of which became a bestseller in Sweden, about his dead father, about his alcoholic mother, one about his wife. I don't know if there were any negatives there. And part of the conversation was, taking yourself from autobiography into fiction, and the fact that you could change a few things and in fiction that you can't do if you're being truthful in a memoir, just as you're saying, or writing your own life story. But in many ways, maybe you can tell the story better if it's fiction, because you can, not worry about the fallout.
Yeah, life is messy. It's true, and fiction is much more controlled. But as I said, I just didn't want to be spending that much time thinking about myself, to be honest. There's so many more. There's so many interesting stories out there, Barbara. There's every day you bump into a story, whether you're looking for one or not. Something will happen to make me go, "Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that," or "Oh, I could maybe do something with that," or "Oh, that strange little thing would fit with that strange little thing," and together I can do something with them. It's much more exciting, much more interesting to me than going, "Oh, and I remember back in 1989 when this happened." It's what interests me is the stories, is making up the stories. Though, mind you, I remember after my mum's funeral, one of my family members saying to me, she said, "Well, now you can write a memoir and an autobiography, can't you? Because there's nobody to contradict you." I thought, this is great.
I don't think that's really quite the point of an autobiography. Nobody.
It's not quite the point of burying your mother either.
No, not at all. No, but I love the idea that you can draw upon, your own experience while you're writing your fiction. I think it makes it, it feels real, for somebody reading the novel. It certainly did reading this one. And when you talk about harassment, or let's not go with harassment. When you talk about the sort of boys club, environment in the newsroom, it feels very real. You must have experienced that. Journalism, there's so much that didn't really welcome women, even in the 1970s.
Yeah, and I think that there's one thing that the police and the world of the media have in common, and that is that in terms of social structures, they're about 10 years behind the rest of society. I think the place you look for, the last bastions of misogyny were always going to be in the police and within the media. And the media hides it better because on the surface they appear to be much more liberal than they are in fact, in practice, for the people who work there. But certainly when I was a journalist in Glasgow in the 1970s, it was very much a man's world. We had about 20, 25 reporters in the newsroom, and we only had 3 women. And we were not allowed to be all on shift together at the same time, because obviously if you had women in the office together, we'd just sit around and swap knitting patterns and gossip. It always amuses me that when women talk about things, it's gossip and it's trivial. But when men talk about the football, that's important, significant conversation.
Well, the British police, I think, have a very militaristic structure. I mean, we've been watching a little bit of Line of Duty, and you can really see how that prevails. But the other thing I was thinking about, I mean, it's going farther back in time, but tonight we're going to be talking to Reese Bowen about her new cozy historical and her Royal Spinous series. And part of this is Christmas at Sandringham in 1935, just before King George dies. And the Prince of Wales brings Mrs. Simpson to a house party that has been staged so he could do that. And Reese reminds us that the British media didn't reveal anything to do or about the Prince and Mrs. Simpson. It was like Lord Beaverbrook, who's actually Canadian, the press lords just shut it all down in a way that's inconceivable today. There's no way that you could have a situation like, Edward and Mrs. Simpson going on for months. And basically the British public doesn't know anything about it because there's a media blackout. I mean,
yeah, and that persisted for a very long time. I mean, really, it only started to fall apart when Charles and Diana's marriage started to fall apart, and newspapers became emboldened to write about Charles and Camilla, first of all, and then subsequently about Diana's relationships. But they kind of left Diana alone in that sense until the marriage was officially over.
Right, but she also volunteered for some media, and now, of course, if I never hear
Absolutely.
anything else about, Meghan and Harry, it will be too soon for me.
You guys can have them.
Oh, thank you.
You can
I
keep
don't want
Meghan
them.
and Harry. We're quite happy that you've got them over there.
I realize that. I'm sorry that we have them ourselves. But I'm not really totally comfortable with The Crown, for example. I've never bothered to watch it. And I really, now they're trying to, on something or other, do a whole thing making Monica Lewinsky into some sort of, feminist hero or something. It was basically a sordid story, for both her and President Clinton. And, it must be so weird for somebody to be, watching their life like that. I mean, if you're a public figure, you take it on, but I don't know if you take it on to that extent.
Yeah, I think it's slightly bizarre. I mean, we are kind of, and again, this is one of the products of what kind of started to happen in the 1980s in the media, the obsession with celebrity culture.
Exactly.
And the phenomenon that we now have of people who are famous for being famous.
Well, yeah, you have the Kardashians and so forth, but I just don't like the idea of watching this kind of stuff play out while these people are still alive and witness to it. If they want to do it when they're dead. I mean, it's kind of coming back to that unfortunate conversation at your mother's funeral. It's like, okay, she's dead. I can tell the story, but in a way, I don't know. It just feels sleazy to me, or opportunistic.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the great difficulty, whether people are alive or dead, is that you never know the truth of what goes on behind the scenes. And this is one of I personally have a real issue with crime novels that purport to be telling you the truth about a fictional, about a real case in a novel. Basically, novels that are retelling cause celeb murder cases that are still within living memory, because those cases still have people who are touched by them. They still have people whose lives have been affected by them. I made that decision really before I started properly writing fiction, back when I was a journalist in Manchester. I don't know how well known the Moors murders cases are in America, but Myra Hindley and Ian Brady were a sort of folie à deux pair in the 1960s, early 1960s in Manchester, who kidnapped, tortured and murdered young people ranging in age from 7 or 8 to 16. And they had 5 known victims. And that case was a profound trauma in Britain. It happened in 1963. The court case was 1965. And it was profoundly shocking because it was a man and woman working together in this sexually sadistic homicide, but also something that had never been done or known about before was that they had photographed their victims, they had photographed what they were doing to them, and they had tape recorded some of their sessions. And this is often described as the case where Britain lost its innocence. And this was a case that had reverberations all down the years. And I worked in Manchester for 10, 12 years. And every 6 months, a story would come up that involved the Moors murders case one way or another. It would be something to do with one of the prison officers would be telling their story, or there would be Myra Hindley would be attempting to win her liberty, or there was one case where another prisoner beat up Myra Hindley and she got plastic surgery. There was all sorts of cases like that. And over the course of the years, I got to know a lot of people involved in the case. I got to know the families of the surviving families of the victims. I got to know people who had worked with Myra Hindley in prison, who had worked with Ian Brady in the secure mental hospital where he ended up. I was actually the first journalist 20 years after the event to get an interview with Ian Brady's mother. So I really understood what the stirring up of this case every so often did to the people who had been touched by it. And I made a promise to myself at that point that I would never use an identifiably contemporary or recent case as fodder for a crime novel, because you never know what you might say that would inadvertently cause pain. And sometimes these cases are still open, and you have no way of knowing if you might inadvertently be interfering with a police investigation, for example. So I steer clear of writing about real cases in my books for that reason, because I just feel uncomfortable about it.
You know, there's a craze right now for podcasts, especially true crime podcasts. And I don't listen to them, and I really don't know what the parameters of them are. I don't know whether these are all cases that have been solved. You know, Anne Rule, for example, wrote a really brilliant book about knowing that serial killer whose name, because I'm old, has gone out of my head, but you know who I mean.
Yeah.
And, you know, that case was done and dusted, and I'm not sure whether he was alive in prison or gone or whatever it was. Thank you, Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
Patrick always saves me when I have these moments by using the chat function on Zoom. So bless his heart. Anyway, I find it, and there's also been, as a result of these podcasts and other things, there's been this kind of push. We did one event with an author who did this, and I really was uncomfortable, and I would never do it again, was trying to draft ordinary people into sort of a social media investigation. It's actually going on with the January 6th riots, where, you know, the law enforcement here has used social media to identify. And the thing that gets most of the people who've been arrested or accused or whatever is their own social media, you know, posting on it that they'd been there or what they had done and so forth. And so I'm not sure where the boundaries are anymore, you know, between real life and fiction, or just exploiting real life. It doesn't seem to me that there really are any boundaries. And what's the difference between social media and regular media? I mean, remember, we used to trust Walter Cronkite. You know, Walter Cronkite would present the news, and, you know, it felt informed, and it felt rational and trustworthy. And now, do we feel like anything is that way?
Yeah. And part of that, I think, was the fact that we only got the news a couple of times a day. I mean, I'm not sure what your news schedules were in the States, but in the UK, you got the television news at 6 o'clock in the evening, and you got it at 9 o'clock in the evening. And that was that. So there was time and preparation went into the events that were covered on the news. It wasn't just, you know, a blog that was updated every 2 minutes. It was actually a measured approach. So you were getting a take on stories, if you like, that had been digested, in that someone had sat down with the stuff, the pieces of information as they were coming in, and made sense of them and put them together in a narrative. And sometimes that narrative was skewed, but on the other hand, you did have the chance of at least having an understanding of the story and not just getting scattergun bits of information. And that's one of the things that has changed about our consumption of news. It also means that we know a lot more about what's going on in the world, because there was a limit to what you could tell in a couple of news bulletins. So you wouldn't necessarily be hearing about a revolution in Kazakhstan, or a great forest fire in Venezuela or something. These were things that just wouldn't penetrate your understanding of the world. It is complicated, I agree, but I do feel uncomfortable, I have to say, about writing things that can inadvertently cause people added pain when they've already been through, frankly, enough.
We haven't actually talked about what the story is in 1979, so perhaps you'd like to do a brief summation for people who might want to read the book.
Yeah, well, Ali Burns is a young journalist. She's a graduate of Cambridge University. She did a couple of years training in the northeast of England, and she's now got a job working in Glasgow. And it's her first really big job. And she's desperate to be an investigative journalist. That's what she wants to be doing. She wants to be digging into the stories that really matter. But because she's a woman in this man's world, all she gets is miracle babies and women's stories, and stories that need the woman's touch. And she chafes at the idea of this. But she does have one kind of secret weapon that is what really helps her to to move sideways from just doing these stories. And that is, she's a good writer. She's very good at composing tabloid copy. And a lot of journalists are not good writers. I can remember we had a couple of guys when I worked on the Daily Record, one guy in particular, who was a brilliant crime reporter. He knew everybody. He had amazing contacts, but he couldn't write a story to save his life. And he'd come into the office with he'd got his story, he'd got his interview, he's got his quotes, all in his notebook, but he couldn't put it together. So sometimes I would be deputed to go and sit with him and hear the story and write it essentially. So Ali has this particular ability, and she hooks up with one of her colleagues, Danny, who is one of the less obnoxious people in the office. And Danny understands that if he's going to get on the way he wants to get on, he can take advantage of Ali's skills, and she could take advantage of his access to the stories. So they kind of form this unexpected alliance. And they first work on a story about financial fraud, and then they later work on a story that has its roots in the forthcoming referendum coming up in Scotland about whether or not Scotland should have a parliament. And there's a lot of political uprisings around the place concerning that. And some people, as is always the case in these things, decide to take things to extremes. And Ali and Danny find themselves at the heart of something that becomes very dangerous indeed.
Well, as you move along over the course of the next 4 books, you'll certainly have a lot of political stuff that you can talk about. We had a conversation last night with Susanna Kersley, who has a new book out and talks about the Scotland's expedition to Darien back in whenever it was, I think 17. Anyway, and how the bankruptcy of that whole thing, it fell apart, led in part to the Union because Scotland was broke. And, you know, economics do play into political unions, national unions. So Brexit introduces yet new elements. I mean, nothing's really different, right?
Yeah, well, I'm not really going there because, you know, I mean, that's just a complete, the country's economy is a basket case at the moment. It's
all I'm saying is, you know, we're 200 and some years on, and yet we're actually not in any different place. I mean, history does repeat itself, even if people happen to read it. So one of the things I liked about this book, Val, was I've only been to Scotland in good weather, but it's January and we're in Glasgow. And, you know, I don't think that creature comforts were on a level that they might be today. So it was pretty brutal.
Yeah, and that was a very particularly cold winter, 78, 79. We had snow on the ground for a month solidly. And there was something like 10,000 households in Glasgow ended up without water because their pipes had frozen and then burst. And you couldn't get a plumber for love nor money. The trains were on strike. There were all sorts of industrial disputes. We had in England bodies going unburied. We had problems with getting tanker deliveries because the tanker drivers were on strike, and then the public employees went on strike. So there were problems with the hospitals, problems with the schools. It was extraordinary. It's like every time you turned around, somebody else was going on strike. I think we actually went on strike one day once, but in general, there was a lot of industrial unrest. There were power cuts. There were days when the electricity would just go off, and that was that. And it was not very much fun. And
it's easy to be smug today and think, you know, well, we've made all this progress. We have indoor plumbing, and you know, we have all this other stuff. And then, you know, the recent wildfires and hurricanes and so forth, they have reminded us that you need an uninterrupted flow of electricity in order for almost anything to work right now. And flooding and so forth is rising with warming seas. And so places that once were really glamorous, you know, coastal cities and so forth to live in, are now becoming dangerous and sparking all kinds of debates. You know, what about flood insurance? Is that an okay thing to encourage people to rebuild in danger zones? You know, it's a whole set of problems. But I like the fact that 1979 reminded me of just how, I mean, I grew up in Chicago, and I remember, Val, when I was in elementary
Mm.
school, the school closed for over, maybe it was almost 2 weeks because it was minus 22 and the heating system fell apart. You know,
Yeah.
this is a wealthy community with, you know, pretty up-to-date technology back in the 1940s. And yet there we all were at home,
No.
probably still burning coal. I think I can remember that the first house that I can remember, we had a coal burning fireplace, and you know, that was like in the 40s. And really,
Mm. Well, we burned coal until certainly into the late 1960s. My parents had coal-fired central heating.
yeah, no, I
We had a
mean, you
stove
know,
in the living
houses
room
came
that
with coal
heated the
chutes
water.
and, you know, storage for coal. And in our old house that I'm talking about actually had a niche for what was called the ice box for a really good reason. And, you know, the iceman would come with a huge block of ice. Well, he
Right.
had, I think by this time he wasn't doing that anymore, but clearly when the house was built, you know, the back section opened up and the guy would put in his chunk of ice and go away, and there you would be. I mean, and that's all in my lifetime, you know, so the rate of technological change has been remarkable.
Yeah.
So what fun
But
for you to be going forward, chronicling it with Alan.
yeah, but it's interesting though. There's so many things that still reflect on where we are now. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
the referendum that happened in Scotland in 1979 was really the start of a conversation we've been having with ourselves over the last 40 odd years, and much of that conversation has been expressed in fiction. It's no coincidence, I think, that Scottish crime fiction really started with William McIlvaney's book, Laidlaw, in 1978, which really was the first novel, certainly I had read, with working class characters who spoke the way that people in the street spoke, and yet which had really poetic description in the rest of the text. And this marriage of the two voices, the two languages, I thought was extraordinary, and gave voice to a community who hadn't had a voice. And the fact that this emerged in a crime novel was really exciting to me because it showed the way that you could write about the world that you lived in, the real world, if you like, and tell stories that were connected into the real world, that weren't just some random murder bolted onto some random village in the south of England. And that notion was kind of cemented for me by Sarah Paretsky's first novel, Indemnity Only, where there's this sense of that novel takes place in Chicago because it had to take place in Chicago, because it couldn't have taken place anywhere else. The lives that people led, the politics they had, the jobs they did, it was all centered around the city and the place. And I think that development in the crime genre made it particularly apposite for the Scots over the last 40 years, as I say, figuring out who are we, what do we want to be in the modern world, what is it to be Scottish in the 21st century. All of these conversations that led to the 2014 referendum and beyond have been largely explored in the world of writing, in poetry and fiction and non-fiction. That's where we've had the conversation, and at the bus stops, obviously, and in the pubs. But the codification of it, if you like, has happened within fiction.
Well, but your own life is so illustrative. As I said, I met you in Oxford, and then we met in Manchester, we met in Northumberland, and now you're back in Scotland, and you know, living in Edinburgh. And it's interesting that your life has taken that kind of, you know, circle. But how wonderful that you're where you are right now with the stories that you want to write.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great time to be living here in Scotland. It's an interesting, exciting time. Of course, everything's like everywhere. The last couple of years have been very strange for all of us, and it'll be really interesting to see how things develop as we go forward from this. It's hard to see how some things are going to return to the way they were. In fact, they just can't, I don't think.
You know, it was a wonderful kind of time out, in a sense that, you know, a lot of things like pollution decreased and traffic was more normal and other things. And yet I have a feeling that we're just going to slingshot right back to where we are because people tend to do that. But I don't know. We will find out. I have one last question, which is, I know you're going to work on this project, but are you going to write any of your other characters in while you're working on these Allie Byrne stories?
I think there will have to be something to save me from my own tendency towards boredom. I have a very low boredom threshold. I can't write 2 books back to back with the same character, and I'm hoping that with Allie, the 10-year gap means that she will have changed and developed and responded to what's happened to her. So it won't be, the Allie Burns of 1989 won't be quite the same as the Allie Burns of 1979 because of the impact things have had on her. But yeah, there will be at least one Karen Pirie in the middle of all of this. And who knows what else.
Oh, good. Well, I mean, one of the fun things about following Val's career is that she's written a number of standalones. So, there's always this kind of moment of unexpectedness that comes along when a new book is announced. And you think, well, what is it going to be?
And I am writing a Miss Marple short story for an anthology that's coming out next year with 12 new Miss Marple stories. So that's going to be fun to do.
That will be fun to do. Murder at the Vicarage has always been my very favorite Miss Marple because it's funny.
Yes.
There's really a lot of humor in it. And I think that you don't see that in all Christie novels, but it's a real delight. And, the Village Mystery form still works.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I'm not decrying it at all. It's just, I want to write different kinds of things as well.
Good. Well, I'm delighted to hear that. Let's call Patrick up from the dark and see if he has questions of his own or questions from anybody who might be watching. Isn't that magical how he comes back? I just love it.
It's Patrick. It's
Hey,
magic.
Val.
There he is.
All right, Patrick,
Hi.
take over.
Well, actually, I have a question for you, Val. Have you written much about, and forgive my ignorance if you have, about the Yorkshire Ripper case much in the background of any of your books?
No,
This was squarely during that time period, was it not?
absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
It was, well, but it was also very much in the early stages of the Ripper, and it was still kind of a local story. It was big in the north of England, but it hadn't really become quite the national story that it became around by sort of 1980, 81. But no, I haven't written about that at all. I was involved in covering the story when it broke, when he was arrested and following the trial and that sort of thing. But it's, yeah, it doesn't interest me either. I mean, it's really not that interesting a case. He's not that interesting a guy. It's only interesting because the police made such a colossal cock up of the investigation. And that's not news in a way. It's not the first or the last time that the police have totally messed up an investigation. In fact, we've just got an inquest opening today in London about someone who murdered 4 young men in London, and the coroner is already asking the question of, if the police had investigated the first murder properly, might they have prevented the other 3? So
Yeah,
it's
a
not
provocative question.
It's interesting, but as I say, I don't think the Yorkshire Ripper, I don't think Peter Sutcliffe's that interesting.
Yeah, well,
killer, really.
I think David Peace did such a brilliant job of writing that 4-book series which was about the case, of course, but also about the whole era.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see.
I think there were elements of that were somewhat exaggerated. I mean, I thought they're brilliant books. They're absolutely brilliant books, but they're not the kind of things that happen in those books. I don't remember them happening in real life. But there you go. It is fiction. It's meant to be fiction, and it is right in a way that it's so exaggerated and so grand guignol.
A little bit stylized, and yeah. Let's see. There are some questions. Okay, Dawn, she just says, do you miss Manchester? The chaos, the culture, the love.
Do I miss Manchester? Well, I don't really miss Manchester. No, I think I found Manchester a really exciting city to live in the 90s, when it is kind of dragging itself back up from being chopped off at the knees by successive governments and by the things that were happening nationally. And Manchester really struggled at that period, but it was also very exciting because people were trying to restore the city to something of its former glory. And now I think it's fair to say, I mean, it is by and large sort of economic success story, and that's kind of less interesting. But I liked living in Manchester because it was a small enough city for all the different worlds to collide and overlap, and that's one of the reasons why I love Edinburgh, is because Edinburgh is a great city, but it's also a village. Unlike London, which is so vast and sprawling, people live in their own little bubble and they never bump into anybody else's bubble because there just isn't a crossover.
Well, Manchester had that massive music renaissance in the 80s, late 80s.
Yeah, yeah, and it was great. I mean, that was another thing that drove the city. It was the music industry. Manchester, it was called. It was called lots of things. It was called Manchester. It was called Gaychester. It was called Gunchester.
Right.
So I had crime. I had great crime. Really good crime to write about.
Lots of drugs too, of course.
Yep. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Well, Dawn actually has a really great question. She asks, Val, if you could interview one criminal, who would it be and why?
I don't know that I have a particular burning desire to interview any particular criminals. I'm quite happy to let other people do that on my behalf, as it were. I'm much more interested in reading the analysis of people who know what they're talking about. We have a woman in the UK, Dr. Gwen Adshead, who was the head of psychotherapy at Broadmoor. And she's just written a book called The Devil You Know, and it's absolutely fascinating.
We did a program with her.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
you'll know,
she's brilliant. I have huge respect for her. And, I think over the years, I've spent a lot of time listening to her on the radio and reading papers that she's written. And I think that she's one of these people who has genuine insight into the kind of people that she's dealing with. And would have much better insight than me because, frankly, I would be there as a voyeur. I'm much more interested in her views as a clinician.
Let's see. Any more questions? Okay, well, Michelle asks, she says, I studied journalism in the 80s and I feel it's heavily influenced my writing. You've kind of addressed this a bit, but she asks, do you think you would have written crime fiction if you hadn't worked as a journalist?
I think I probably would, because the desire to write fiction was born, as I was saying earlier, when I was much younger, sort of when I was about 9 or 10, reading the Chalet School books. I thought, this is what I want to do. And I started reading crime fiction round about the same time. Agatha Christie was my gateway drug, because I used to stay a lot with my grandparents when I was a kid, and they only had 2 books in the house. They had a copy of the Bible, and they had a copy of Agatha Christie's The Murder at the Vicarage. So whenever I ran out of things to read, I would reread The Murder at the Vicarage. And imagine my delight when I saw at the beginning of the book that Agatha Christie had written more than 1 book. So that was me. That was my mission, to go and read Agatha Christie. And incidental to that, I discovered all the other giants of crime fiction and just managed to get. In fact, I stole my mum's library tickets so that I could get into the adult library and get my hands on the crime fiction. And that became my drug of choice, I suppose, my habit. And all through my teens and my early 20s and to this day, I've always got at least 1 crime novel on the go at any given time. So I think, whatever I had done in terms of making a living, when I started writing properly, seriously, it would have been crime fiction.
Have you read Ian Rankin's continuation of that final McIlvany novel?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you like it?
And it's an interesting project.
Yeah. Did you read Laidlaw in real time, like when it was first coming out?
I gave Ali Burns my copy of Laidlaw. I read Laidlaw in 78, 79. It came out in 78, and I read it. It was either late in the year that it came out or early the following year, and I bought it in a secondhand bookshop in Glasgow, and I was blown away by it.
Yeah, it's great. They've been reissuing the novels over here in these really handsome new editions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Which is
Barbara.
wonderful because he was a pioneer in what is now called tarte noir. I'm not even
Yes.
sure what that means, but I like it. I would like to say to the person who asked about Manchester, if you are at all interested in serial television, long form television, there's a series called Scott and Bailey, which is set in Manchester, a policing series. And while I mean, a lot of it's fantastical and you don't necessarily even like all the characters, Manchester is great. And as I said to Rob when we were watching it, I have no idea where casting found some of the people that appeared in that show. I mean, it was just like, did they go out in the street and haul them in? Or, you know, were these actors that same, I mean, it's really an astonishing program. It's 4 seasons and then a very brief 3-season continuation, because I think when the woman who's kind of the superior of Scott and Bailey, when she retires at the end of season 4, that actress, I think she was the focal point of it. And so the last 3 didn't work as well for me, but that's just me. And if you're interested in some of what we've been talking about, there's a very hot British series called Line of Duty, which is quite brutal, set in, where is it set? Is it London, Val?
It's not. It's never specifically
Never said.
alluded
Right.
to. It's actually filmed in Belfast,
Ah,
but it's
well,
not set in Belfast.
in season 2, there are some really horrific scenes about a woman police officer who's put into prison awaiting trial and the things that happened to her. And, you know, there's, I don't know if I'm going to go the whole distance. Dana Stabenow, our mutual friend, has insisted that we watch the whole thing. And I think there may be 5 seasons. But if you're at all interested in British policing,
Well, it's interesting, you know, Barbara, the actor that you're talking about from Scott and Bailey, Amelia Bullmore.
Yes.
Amelia is also a writer.
Yes, she is.
Amelia and I worked together on a series called Traces, which was made by Alibi and has been on BBC. I'm not sure if it's being shown in America. I think it is. And I've just finished series 2 of that. And I have to say that I think Amelia is not just a meticulous actor, but she's also an absolutely meticulous writer.
Absolutely, Val.
she's
I couldn't
brilliant.
agree with you
She's
more. I
brilliant.
thought the episodes that she wrote were the best ones. And there is one episode which I cannot identify where she is summoned from Manchester or to another, anyway, outside of her own particular bailiwick. And the way that she takes command of that and the way she issues instructions and tells people what to, I mean, her command of how policing ought to work as illustrated in that, I thought was absolutely brilliant. I think I watched it 3 times just to appreciate it.
Well, I'm having dinner with her in a few weeks' time. I'll tell her.
Oh, please do.
But the other thing that's really interesting about Scott and Bailey is that they use the interview techniques are very subtle, and these are the actual interview techniques that contemporary detectives have been learning. They're not the sort of confrontational. It's not the threatening. It's a very sort of gentle teasing out of information from people, and it's completely based on what the reality is now in an interview room, certainly in the UK.
Well, it's fascinating. I wish, please tell her for me that I really wish she'd come back and do some other work, because I mean, we were just shattered when, you know, when she left at there had been a trauma that had happened to her and kind of propelled her.
This is Line of Duty you're talking about?
Huh?
This is Line of Duty?
No,
No, we're talking about
Bailey.
Scott and Bailey.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as Val said, the woman who is the cast as the kind of central, I think, even though Scott and Bailey are two officers, I think that Amelia's role is the focal point of the series.
And the producer of that, of course, is Nicola Schindler, who has made other things like Happy Valley, and Last Tango in Halifax, Gentleman Jack. So there's many things that some of the really class things on your screen, Years and Years, It's a Sin, have all come from Nicola Schindler's company. She's a great producer.
There's certainly some wonderful television that has come up during the pandemic. I mean, Val's a veteran of, and because the acting community is not huge in the UK, and also, Val, we've been watching a lot of French crime fiction television. Once again, it's a relatively small pool of actors. It's interesting to see them, show up in different roles, and you have to try to shed your version of them that appeared here and, translate it into the new one. Robson Green is an example. He's a fairly protean actor.
Well, he's a good actor. He's
very good.
Yeah.
Let me just, Linda has asked a couple of quick questions, or actually one question. I think she's commenting about the situation in the post-Brexit world in the UK. She says, we'll never get back the companies that closed, jobs lost, economic disasters. Her question is, why does the media focus on some cases while ignoring others? How would you change coverage if you could?
Well, the sort of quick answer to that is the media goes for cases that it thinks are sexy, which generally means attractive young women or small children. That's really what it boils down to. I do subscribe to the everybody counts or nobody counts school of thought when it comes to crime and murder, and I personally think we should pay much more attention, particularly to domestic violence, where women die every single week at the hands of their partners or their ex-partners, and that doesn't get the headlines because it's not sexy. And that's would be one of the areas that I would certainly think that I would like to see much more focus on.
It comes back to what we were saying earlier about clicks, that, the media has kind of given way to clicks because that's what brings in advertising and brings in readers and so forth. And so it's not a particularly even-handed culture. We just had with the young woman whose body was found in the Grand Teton National Park. I'm trying to remember her name, Petito or something. Anyway, and one of the questions that has arisen was, she was a young, attractive white girl. So why did she get all the media attention when women of all different colors and economic backgrounds disappear all the time?
Absolutely.
So, what can I say? Anyway, Val, what a pleasure it has been to catch up with you. I'm so glad we had this opportunity.
Always a delight.
Well, it always is wonderful to talk to you. And actually, we do have such a long history. I mean, nearly half a lifetime together. Wow.
Yeah.
I'll send you a picture of Rob and the puppies because you'll really enjoy it. You can see how close you might have come to having a whole family. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us.
You.
There'll be a podcast, and I'll send Val links, and there'll be a podcast of our conversation. And we've now decided that these videos will not just live on Facebook, which after the outage yesterday reminded us that nothing is certain, but we're going to move them into YouTube as well. So hopefully we'll be able to maintain our wonderful library of conversations. So thank you all very much for joining us. Good night, Val. Good afternoon.
Good night. Thanks for having me.
Night.
It was really a pleasure. See you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.